Hi. I'd just first of all like to thank Mr. H. Thomas Ackerman here for his brilliant video, Dissent and Intelligence Deception. And as he says, you know, that's one of the wonderful things about YouTube, is people sharing their thoughts and ideas, and how we inspire each other, and how we're then inspired to move further in our thoughts and thinking. And so everything that Mr. Ackerman has shared here has also inspired this video now, because it's encouraged me to share some clarification, further clarification on the idea of intelligence. And one of the things that I think does need to be clarified, and Mr. Ackerman has shared this in some of his other videos, is that intelligence is essentially consciousness. Okay? Intelligence isn't a thing of its own. Intelligence is consciousness itself. And the difference that between humans and other creatures on this planet is that humans have a conscience, and that directly connected to that conscience is empathy and compassion for life beyond ourselves. And that is our gift to life on Earth, okay? Because everything on Earth has a purpose for life, to serve life. So say for example a bee. A bee's prime function and delight is to visit flowers, gather pollen, make it into honey. It always makes a surplus of honey, and in that process all the trees are pollinated, and the flowers, and that means that more seeds will be created, and more plants, trees and flowers will grow, and that means that there will be more flowers for the bees to pollinate, to gather pollen from and pollinate and make more honey every year. So we're operating on a system of abundance there. So you could say that the bee is a capitalist, but the bee is also a socialist. It lives within a community, and it operates as it takes, it gives. And it actually gives more than it receives, but even though it's giving more than it receives, it's also itself gaining a surplus. And that, I think, is something that humanity seems to have disconnected from, that level of intelligence, of the consciousness, of living within the consciousness of the life of our planet. So one of the things that happened to me, because I did suffer a lot of trauma in childhood, and at one stage in my life I had to relive that trauma in order to heal from it, and I had to peel back the veneers of consciousness that had overlaid all of that, and it was all to do with this world, and that had set desires and ambitions in my heart that were to do with this world. I was able to I had to peel back those veneers in order to rescue my inner child and reconnect with my true self, my inner self. And so, yes, it was very painful to remember the abuse and the trauma, but at the same time, I also reconnected with the absolute wonder of childhood, and reconnected with the pureness of my heart. And it was then that I understood consciousness in the sense of, you know, intelligence operates within consciousness, in as much as we can survive, it's all about survival. And so the consciousness that I was aware of, it was a consciousness, it was an intelligence, an understanding that was purely of the very fact that I'm a physical being alive in this living world. And I used to experience that quite regularly, because there was a beautiful park not far from my home that I would regularly go and visit. I'd be told, you know, Debbie, take the kids out, and as I'd be out, you know, with like 4 children at the age of 8. I mean, people just wouldn't do it these days, but you know, that's how it was. So I'd be there in this park, and it was an amazing park. There was a rockery, bowling green, putting green, some huge, about 3 or 4 huge greenhouses around the edges of the park that had cacti in and banana trees, and there was woodland areas, and it was a lovely place. There was a pond with ducks and fish and frogs and tadpoles, and as I used to go to the park, that was where I'd noticed the seasons, the difference in the trees, the blossom for spring, and the holly berries out in winter. And actually, I just appreciated every season. It was just beautiful, and I remembered how, and reconnected with that to the extent that it is with me now. Because I've reconnected to my original consciousness that was something that was within my being as a living creature created by this universe on this living planet. That I understood when I stood in the little woodland area. I knew that the trees were conscious, that they were intelligent. I just knew that. I knew that the tree knew I was there, in the same way I knew the tree was there. And I remember being really upset, you know, that the birds all flew away from me. Because, you know, again, fear is a taught thing, isn't it? The creatures in a place like Britain have learned to be afraid of humanity because we're such dangerous, destructive creatures at the moment in this part of the world. Whereas when humans go visit places where humans haven't been, animals don't know anything bad from humans, the animals show no fear. So we know fear is a taught thing. True fear is apprehension, caution is true fear. The other type of fear that's is inspired by a criminal, you see. So I've been promoting universal love, abundance and compassion, which upholds life rights, human rights, women's rights, children's rights, animal rights, plant rights, earth rights. It upholds all our rights, and it is naturally designed to protect our rights and defend our rights, and most especially the child. The child is the prime concern. And actually, if you look at the natural world, by overwhelming majority, most of the creatures are devoted to raising the next generation. Most of the creatures are devoted to that. They devote all their time and attention on their young. They will exhibit amazing courage to defend their young. and they will resort to violence if they have to defend and protect their young. But when you look at humanity, we're witnessing the opposite, really. Because, again, you know, I've said it before in other videos, but it is a prime problem with humanity, that in this so-called developed world, because I don't include here, you know, obviously the people that live outside of that, that the child has been legally defined as a minor human being, an unimportant, lesser human being. Now, any so-called intelligent derived of the consciousness that has separated itself from the consciousness in dissent of that consciousness in order to satisfy its own desires and wants. That's a criminal consciousness, because it's decided that it doesn't want the abundance and beneficence of universal law, because actually it's got some strange ideas, because perhaps it's mentally ill, perhaps it's a psychopath, but for whatever reason it's not happy within the beneficence of general society. So it puts itself outside of that and then seeks to impose its will on that. And impose its own law. So, you know, strip women of the rights. Women and children, they're secondary. Well, as soon as you've done that, that's it then, and you've disconnected the man from his women and children. That's one way of appropriating the power of the men, who are the strongest, who can lug and carry for you. You want them. You need their time and energy. So you need them to devote the bulk of their time and energy to you and your will. And obviously they're going to find it's going to be a lot easier to get them to do that if they've disconnected their connection and compassion and consciousness with the woman and child. Now, this painting that Mr. Ackerman's done here, which is absolutely fantastic, absolutely love it. I think it's so expressionist of our time, and even, you know, the mirror writing free radical here. But it is absolutely spot on as a representation, as a reflection of this very moment in history. Of, you know, this famous iconic painting of the Mona Lisa, very loosely represented here on what looks like crumpled paper, creased paper, that represents the trashiness of the icon and even the pollution of it, of the consciousness that created it. That's a backward mirror image, really, of what reality should be. And years ago, I did put on my Facebook, and it was an experiment. I just wrote, burn the most. I think that we need to burn the Mona Lisa. We should just burn it. And usually my posts on Facebook, they'll get one like and a couple of comments, or, you know, maybe a share now and again. This one, well, the thread, it went over 100. And there was the odd one or two who had written, yeah, burn it, or yeah, it's a horrible picture anyway, and blah, blah, blah. But the overwhelming majority You know, it was, I'm a Philistine, and oh, you couldn't burn the Mona Lisa, and oh, it's outrageous, and it was just on and on and on, this passion that came through about for the Mona Lisa. And I'm sure the majority of the commenters that found my status offensive had never even seen the Mona Lisa. Now, Mr. Ackerman informs us that he has seen the Mona Lisa, and it struck him, you know, people were actually bowing before it, you know, genuflecting before it, that it's almost like a religious icon. And the thing is that after I'd read all these comments and everything, then I'll put up on my post, well, you've all took part in this experiment, and I really wish that that people could have that same passion and same concern and awareness and love and respect for the children, the poorest children of Africa, or the poorest children of India, or the poorest children of America or Britain, or just for the child. Because apparently they're all expendable, but the Mona Lisa is priceless. Now, when you say priceless, that means no amount of gold could buy it, because let's face it, gold is very valuable, isn't it? And it's always held a very high value, and people are conditioned to believe that gold is very precious. And this is what I mean about the veneers of consciousness that get overlaid onto a child, so that from a very young age the child's heart becomes connected to the head, to the thoughts that are telling it gold is very precious, and they're learning, oh, you get more gold, you're going to, you know, you'll be able to do what you want, you'll be able to have whatever you want if you have a lot of this gold. And it gets to the point, doesn't it? You know, like people are prepared to do menial tasks for lesser value metals so that they can eat. When their food production, oh, sorry, no, you're no longer allowed to grow your own food. Sorry, no, you're no longer allowed to have your own land. This land's owned by this lord who's got all this gold. You're going to live by what he wants. And which aspects of consciousness are going to most serve this dissenting consciousness, the criminal consciousness that has decided that no, actually, I do not want to live within universal law. I want to be able to do exactly what I want. I want to enjoy the freedom of being a beast in a human body. Because that's what it amounts to. So, what aspects of human consciousness are going to be most attracted, and is this dissenting consciousness going to attract from the consciousness, the cooperation that operates within universal law? It's always going to be the minority that's going to come through. So the consciousness that is going to most favour is going to be the psychopath. Now, within the context of universal law and a cooperative that is operating both on socialist and capitalist principles, in a positive way that creates abundance, then the psychopath will be no problem. Okay? But if you've got this dissenting criminal consciousness that has now informed the consciousness, imposed on the consciousness the value of gold, say, then the psychopaths will be rewarded for bringing more gold. So it's like, well, whoever can bring me the most gold, you are going to be rewarded with power, and your will be free to, you know, be able to do whatever you like. The bulk of the consciousness are living with compassion and have a conscience, because that's the measure of our compassion. We know when we're stepping outside the bounds of compassion, when we start to feel pangs of conscience. Oh, I shouldn't really be doing that. But sometimes we override that conscience by necessity, because we understand that we need to do this, otherwise it will be detrimental for life. So wherever there's positivity, so yes, there's room for destruction within the consciousness. There's room for destruction. Like, for example, and this is a prime example, the native people of the land now called Australia, they used to do regular little slashes and burns in the forest, and by doing that they protected the forest from suffering these massive forest fires that would just consume everything. And so they learn to sustain the forests by these minor scorching, okay. And that was what they did, because they managed their land, they'd learned. And so, yes, it goes against their conscience to destroy the nature, but they understand if they don't do that, then nature will ultimately be destroyed. That, you know, that is their purpose, is to so that nature doesn't have to suffer these things. So there's some intelligence operating within the consciousness, some competence, because that's what it comes down to, really. Intelligence comes down to competence. It's the dissenting aspect of intelligence that has defined competence as intelligence, and that judges between what aspects of human competence are most important and valuable. Okay? So the competence as women was considered least valuable, except for having children. Her brain, they decided, was of less important. What her thoughts were really of least value, because she's there just to have children. She's just a body to produce children, to have sex with and produce children. She's there for the pleasure of man. She's his natural slave. This is of this dissenting consciousness. So, you know, what I've done here is I've turned the tables on this criminal consciousness, haven't I? Because they would call me a dissenter, and the same as they would call Mr. Ackerman a dissenter. But actually, it is they who have dissented. And actually, we need to understand that they are an inferior consciousness. They are an inferior aspect of human consciousness. They are inherently damaged in some way, and they are supported by the psychopathic consciousness simply because they have been able to put forward this idea that gold is extremely valuable, and if you're prepared to kill, you'll get a lot of gold. And so that's easy for the psychopaths to do, isn't it? They are going to be rewarded with wealth and power for doing what to them is easy, because they've got no conscience. They're disabled. They're disabled in some way. And like I say, in a lawful world they don't pose any problem, because they get fully rewarded actually by living lawfully. Because being a psychopath doesn't mean to say you're stupid, that you're of, you know, low understanding. But once you've set this other power structure up that's saying to the minority psychopath aspect of human consciousness, which, you know, it's a natural part of human consciousness, it's a useful part, every aspect of human consciousness is important for the cooperative. We are a diverse species with diverse skills. We're a very complex species because we need to be like that to look after our planet. And that, you know, that's why I've said that the story of Noah is so important, because it shares, it expresses the understanding that a man like Noah, who was connected to his environment, was connected to the consciousness, was able to be intuitively aware that a major change was coming, and he acted on that, and he created his ark and saved animals and plants. And we know that every culture has this story. It's something common that humanity has the capacity to prepare in advance and protect life and to save life. You know, in that sense we are a grace and a gift to life. But like I say, once you've got this idea that there's this alternative law that you can live by, if you're male and you're really big and strong, and you can get this gold because actually then you're connected to God, this concept of God as something outside of nature that looks at nature as something expendable, then yeah, go and destroy a rainforest to get the gold out of it. Pollute all the rivers with mercury. Turn that mountain to dust to get the gold. Because actually the rainforest, the mountain, it's not really important. What's important is our gold. And then with that we can control even more people to do menial tasks for the paper that we're giving them now. You know, at one point coins were worth their value in metal, and then with gold, because it's very heavy, it's like, oh well, I could write you a paper note, and then if you give that to anybody, you know, you bring it back, I'll give you your gold, you get a gold coin with that paper note. Well, as soon as that happened, and then next minute the money essentially is a fiction, because it's no longer directly connected to the gold, is it? But the gold itself, the value of gold itself was a fiction, so of course it's going to create a fictional money supply, because there was never really any truth in the idea that gold is very valuable to life. It isn't. Life can survive without gold. That's the fact of it. Gold's a byproduct. As I've said before, you know, the ancient South Americans called it the excrement of the gods, and they were absolutely right. Which it is. It's a byproduct of a supernova, an exploding supermassive star. So once you've set this thing up, and then you've got these historical icons that are actually no amount of gold could buy, and then you start to understand how these veneers of consciousness that actually infect the human heart with desires and love for things that ordinarily, when they, as part of the consciousness, they just would have no appreciation for, in that sense that it's like, oh yeah, that's nice, but it's not more important than the children. And only an inferior consciousness could judge a child minor. Only an inferior consciousness could do that. Only an inferior intelligence could judge a woman inferior. But that inferior intelligence, because it's afraid, because it knows it's inferior, and it's jealous, it's full of jealousy, it's full of greed, because there's something wrong with it. And humanity, instead of understanding that, you know, this is a disabled consciousness that needs help, this consciousness has taken power for itself because it's so afraid and paranoid, and it's got all these, and it's particularly attracted the lower empathy aspects of human consciousness. So that's made it very powerful, because they're prepared to do things. They're prepared essentially to commit a crime, aren't they, to get what they want. That's the gist, that's the bottom line of it. That consciousness is prepared to commit crimes against life and humanity in order to get what it wants. And it's because of its usually perverse, obviously perverse wants, because they couldn't be lawful wants, could they? Because if they were lawful wants, it would have been quite happy living within the bounty and harmony and balance of universal law of abundance and compassion that upholds life rights. Obviously that consciousness feels restricted and inhibited by those rights, because, you know, maybe it's got perverse desires for children, or maybe it wants to just be able to go and get whatever woman it wants, regardless of whether she wants to be with him. And it has largely attracted the male, because, as I say, the male is most powerful and as a physical being, and he can keep the women and children oppressed. So the true dissenters are actually the people who would call Mr. Ackerman a dissenter, or myself a dissenter. Now, Jesus, and it always struck me, you know, Jesus said, follow the head, not the heart. And that always struck me as strange, if from childhood, because, you know, he's such a compassionate person, that I thought Jesus would have said, always follow your heart. But Jesus was preaching to a people who'd been damaged and polluted by Rome. Rome was an occupying force. Their social conscience and consciousness was damaged. People were disconnected from it. They'd even absorbed Roman practices of having special temple coins that people had to buy at a rate, you know, and participate in usury in order to get these coins, which was a uniquely Roman tradition. So people were disconnected from their culture, and therefore they were disconnected because culture comes from your natural environment, and then they're disconnected from their conscience, and so then their consciousness is led astray. And so, you know, Jesus is saying what was in their hearts, which was for gold, and all the judgments against women and children, that no, you need to follow the head, follow what the consciousness is explaining to you, and the heart will naturally allow the heart to reconnect with your inner child, and then your heart will be pure, and your heart will absorb the intelligence of the consciousness, and your heart will be supportive, they will be aligned. And so we have to live by what we know. okay? Because we need to understand that our hearts have been infected for centuries now by these inferior minorities that have created this whole system, and that they have been valuing, you know, the least of our human capabilities, which is the ability to memorise things perfectly. They have actually made that as the most important, that, you know, people who have the best memory are the most intelligent people. People who can recite word for word every word of the New Testament, say. People that can memorise things, that can behave like a parrot, are the most intelligent people who need the most power. And actually, now, neuroscience is explaining to us that, no, actually, these people aren't the most intelligent people. It doesn't equate to high intelligence. It's not to say that everybody with a good memory isn't intelligent, but by majority, they're not as intelligent as people who forget the trivialities that they take time to remember. And that is because the people who have the capacity to forget actually are absorbing more information, are able to absorb more information than the people who are focusing on the nitty-gritty. But you need those people who focus on the nitty-gritty, yes. It isn't to say that they're less valuable, because, as I say, all aspects, we're a diverse species, and all aspects of human intelligence within the consciousness are valuable and important. It's very important to have people who can memorise certain things. There is gainful employment for those people. It's about identifying them in childhood, not in order to say, oh, this child's got a good memory, top of the class to you. Oh, this child's got a really bad memory, sorry, no, bottom of the class to you. It isn't to judge, it's to understand that, oh, this is where this child is most competent. Oh, this child's very competent here. So you guide the child to into their vocational presence within the consciousness, as a servant to the consciousness, and as also the consciousness being a servant to the child, in the same way that the tree full of blossom is both servant. The bee and the tree are servant to each other, aren't they? So there is a point, because our hearts are infected, so we do need now to follow the new knowledge that's coming into our heads, into our consciousness, and understand the natural intelligence of this universe, that created intelligence of life. As I say, everything that lives is intelligent. A flower is intelligent. And I understood that as a child, that a flower is intelligent, that a tree is intelligent, that a bird is intelligent. But just in a different way to myself, because I as a human being, I'm a part of a species that has been created to care. Now, you know, this person asks here, are we in a simulation? And obviously, you know, he is only talking about the so-called developed world. And actually we are living in a simulation. We are living in a simulated reality. It's something that's been going on, being established over centuries, layers of history, with this consciousness, this inferior consciousness that judges our children minor and robs women of rights. Okay? That demands slavery and usury, that thrives on usury. that thrives on a false valuation of a metal, that makes an icon out of a painting, that then so fills people's hearts, because our hearts are changed according to the information that's coming into our consciousness, that our heart connects to it. And it is an entirely simulated reality, and it is operating essentially on a fiction. And so, you know, it all comes down as well to then the division within the consciousness, that one of the things that has allowed this simulation to be accepted as normal and real to humanity is because then humanity itself has been extracted out of the natural consciousness and our natural law, and we've been raised really like guinea pigs in a lab. And so, yeah, it does mean that it is hard breaking free from that. It is hard waking up and realising, oh my gosh, look at the damage. But that's one of the wonderful things about the abundance of life, is that there's an abundance of humanity today to clean this planet up and build a heaven on this earth, and we have the technology to do it. But the way this consciousness operates, this inferior consciousness, it thinks that the technology is there to enslave us. No, the technology is there to serve us when we live within the beneficence of universal law. And we can build a heaven on this earth. And there would never be a population explosion, because it's a known fact that wherever women and children have no rights and men are turned into slaves to serving the inferior consciousness, then yeah, there is going to be populations explosions. Little girls end up having babies. I mean, they don't talk about the very low mortality rate, but, you know, never mind about that. There's too many people. But it is a known fact that wherever there's been a modicum of rights for women and children and a reasonable living standard, and men aren't reduced to the value of slave, that people have a good standard of living and interest, well, birth rates plummet to the extent that suddenly a nation starts getting worried about an ageing population. But in order to keep the simulation going and all the powers that it serves and maintains and sustains, then, oh, you're going to have to kill billions of people, because that consciousness cannot sustain this, cannot sustain life, okay? It feeds off life. Life apparently is there just for it. It isn't there to give, it's there to take. It doesn't understand. There's something wrong with it. It's a sick consciousness. It just doesn't understand. Now, one of the ways that they have been so successful in the last century is because they managed, very cleverly, they realised once the consciousness had risen up against slavery, they realised that they were going to have to do something about that. So they created this idea of capitalism and socialism, you see. When actually, as I've explained right at the beginning, capitalism and cooperation, capitalism and socialism are two things that work together within a cooperative. Within a cooperative, that operates within a lawful consciousness. Okay? But they have taken one aspect and they've justified what they've done by labelling it capitalist. Okay? But just as the mirror reflects the opposite side of reality, so they too reflect the opposite side of universal reality, universal consciousness. Because just as humanity operates on an equally capitalist and socialist level, so too does the inferior consciousness also operate on a capitalist and socialist level. Okay? But their impact is negative, because what it amounts to is corporate communism or state communism. That's the choice. That's the choice. That is their mirror reflection. And for them, they enjoy their own little socialism, except, you know, they're always at each other's throats, plotting and conniving against each other, because they're all power-hungry mad people. They are a wolf pack. They are based on the Roman consciousness of wolf pack, Romulus and Remus, raised by wolves. So you need to understand that this is an inferior consciousness. It is a dissenting consciousness. It is a criminal consciousness. And so the people that have been conned into that, because their hearts have been overlaid by the veneers of that wrong consciousness. So those people, if you want to liberate yourself, you will just have to have faith in the knowledge. Okay? To clean your heart, you need to have faith in the knowledge. Faith in the truth, in reality, because that's where life is. And the inferior consciousness is a danger, because it is inferior, it's stupid, and it will destroy the whole planet. And it is operating on an equally inferior writings of history, isn't it? Because we know the Bible's been polluted by Roman consciousness, the wolf consciousness, and that they included that evil revelations in it. The work of Cerinthus, who plagiarised bits of the original Testament prophecies and patched them all together to create some sort of Luciferian nightmare. Okay? And I have explained that in a previous video, but that's the fact of it. So then they're following that, and people have been, all these people who have been, hearts have been infected to value gold, to make judgments against children as minors, to worship the Mona Lisa, you know, like there'd be a massive uproar if something bad happened to the Mona Lisa, but you know, nobody's bothered about loads of starving children every year, you know, that kind of thing. That it is when we're prepared to follow the knowledge that explains to us, look, you just need to forget it. I know it's hard, and you've got into these patterns, but it is time now to start a new pattern. I know this is what you feel comfortable with right now and what you think is normal, but I tell you now, if you carry on with this pattern, you are walking like a lemming running towards the edge of a cliff. So if you want to survive, you're going to have to turn this corner now. Instead of going straight on where you normally go straight on, you need to turn this corner and meet the consciousness that's standing around that corner, and accept it's not inferior because it hasn't got a doctorate. Okay? And that to understand that the people who are being called dissenters, they're not the dissenters. We're not the dissenters. We aren't the dissenters. It's dissenters calling us dissenters. It's minor intelligences calling our children minors. We need to understand that, and we need to stand up for our children's future. Because as far as I'm aware, we are the last living line of defence between absolute madness just totally destroying this planet, and yes, their evil level revelations will be fulfilled. Or we accept that there's a wealth of humanity that's hungry for work, that's hungry to express itself, to enjoy life, to do something good. And we have the tree of life, don't we? Hemp, the hemp plant, which does grow as tall as a tree. And it can give us everything. Fibre, the clothing, paper, even they can make plastics out of it, oil, fuel, food, fertiliser, you know, and it's all ecological, that the technology can serve us, that we could do so many wonderful things, and we would be so joyful, because that is what this inferior consciousness robs us of most, joy, because it itself derives no joy in lawful living. That's why it's broken out away from it, because for some reason they can't feel joy. So we need to recognise when we're living within universal law, if ever we do manage to do it, then we will recognise those consciousnesses that, oh, these people need help. But instead, what's happening in the inferior in the world governed by the inferior consciousness, is that the people who really would be defined as needing help are put into positions of great power, and they are then inflicting mental illness on other people who just can't cope in the madness, and they're the ones being diagnosed mentally ill. And it does come down to the very fact that at the end of the day, humanity needs to make that choice now. Because what you're staring at is, do you want the tree of life or do you want a bag of gold? Which one is going to feed your children? Which one is going to give you clothing and food and everything you need? And which one is just going to be a dead weight? Do you choose the tree of life, or do you choose the gold? That's the choice that we make. With the tree of life comes universal law, consciousness, where there's no measure of intelligence to say, oh, you're very intelligent, so we're going to give you loads of wealth and put you in a high place in the world, and oh yeah, you're just average. You know, because there's only like the odd person who's intelligent. Because yes, the minority needs the mind to draw more minorities from the mass. That's why they create these population explosions, so they can get a greater mass of their minority. We need to understand this. We need to understand it, and we need to make our choice. The tree of life or the gold. Okay? Our children are VIPs. The child is a VIP. In every nation, every child is a VIP. They need our help. They need a future. This minor, inferior consciousness wants to impose an unrepayable debt on them and their children and their children and their children, and they will rewrite history, and they will blame the very people that they've persecuted and oppressed. They'll blame them. They're blaming humanity for the destruction of our planet. Is humanity TEPCO? Well, humanity is TEPCO, while ever humanity has no faith in the consciousness, the naturally intelligent consciousness that provides universal law, that supports our consciousness, that doesn't hurt our conscience. Because when our conscience is not burdened, is not hurt, that is when we have the capacity to feel joy. And that is why forgiveness is so important. And obviously at some stage in history there's been no forgiveness, and that's what's given rise to this minority consciousness that is incapable of experiencing joy. I mean, we know from Roman culture, the wolf pack culture that, you know, invaded how many nations, because it's so compassionate, it's quite happy to slash and murder, to rob people for the gold, okay? We know that that consciousness was poisoned with lead and mercury, which does rob the consciousness of a capacity to experience joy. So they seek pleasures through depravity, through crime, because they can't find any pleasure in being nice to people. They impose, they cross-transfer their fears onto other people. Their unhappiness. If all these people are unhappy, that actually makes them feel happy, because they measure themselves. Oh, well, at least I'm not being tortured. At least I'm not in that ring being pulled by a lion. Oh, I feel happy. Yes. So I know this has been a long talk, but I really hope that people have learnt something from it. And I've took the time to do it because, you know, as Mr. Ackerman takes his time, because we're educating each other. There's a community of people out there, and we are educating each other, and we are hopefully guiding humanity towards a brighter day, okay? And we're turning things the right way up, though it seems to the people that are caught in the simulation that, oh no, we're turning everything upside down. But no, actually we're turning things the right way up. We're turning the tables on the people who were turning the tables on us. We're saying, no, you know, this food that you've laid out for us, it's not edible, it's trash. And there was 2 whales washed up, I think in France, just in the last few days. And it was so sad. Their stomachs were full of plastic. Absolutely full of plastic. And, you know, only a species without a conscience, disconnected from conscience and consciousness and compassion, the 3 C's, could not immediately learn from that. Okay? So, you know, make your choice soon, please, humanity, because time is running out for the next generation. And it is time for us to stand up for the child's rights, because that is the only way now. Stand up for your children's rights. Make the child a VIP and start enjoying being a human being.